Hi, welcome. I'm Kate Mackay, Associate Film Curator here at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. Excuse me today, I was just rebooting my computer and it's taking forever to reboot. So I'm coming at you via my iPhone and I don't have any of my notes in front of me, but I'm very excited to welcome you to the BAMPFA live stream presentation of the conversation between Meehan Crist and Brett Story about the hottest August. And it's couldn't be more perfect in this unusually hot August Bay Area weather day to be talking about this fantastic, super compelling film. So I'm very, very happy that the audience has found us here and if you haven't seen The Hottest August yet, you can find it at bampfa.org with all of our other watch from home offerings. And I hope you have a chance to explore. There are some great movies online for you to see. We really miss you in the Barbara Osher Theater, but this does give us an opportunity to bring far-flung guests to your computer screen. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Meehan Crist and Brett Story, and I'll have them give a brief introduction of themselves as I don't have their extensive bios in front of me. So welcome, Meehan and Brett.
Thanks, Kate. This is Brett speaking. For some reason, I can't turn on my video, but hopefully that will resolve momentarily. Oh, here I am. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. My name's Brett Story. I'm a filmmaker and writer, and I'm currently sheltering in place still in Toronto, and I'm the director of The Hottest August. And it's nice to see your faces, some of your faces, and to be here tonight.
And my name is Meehan Crist, and I'm the writer in residence in biological sciences at Columbia University. And I also write quite a bit about climate change and love this film. So I'm very excited to be in conversation with Brett tonight. So I was gonna start with a few questions and then open things up to the group later on. If you wanna ask questions, you can write them into the chat. But I just wanted to start, Brett, I feel like this is a complicated and strange time, and it seems sort of appropriate just to ask, how are you?
Yeah, right. I mean, do we have language for articulating the mud of feelings of being on the planet right now? It's so interesting. I feel like, you know, the sort of dread and stress and grief and motivation that I often feel about living in the era of the climate crisis has, you know, it's not exactly taken a back seat. It's just sort of, it's intensified and also sort of moved to the side during the pandemic. And it's interesting to sort of talk about how we're all doing now, because it feels like the words we'll use are very similar to how we might describe how many of us have been feeling over many years now, but it's all so much more intense. And that's all my way of saying I am okay, I'm safe and healthy, and so is my family. But I feel a lot of grief and mourning and boredom and stress, acute stress. I feel distracted all the time. I find it hard to concentrate. And I miss people a lot. I miss friends, but I also miss strangers a lot. And actually I've been thinking about what it might be like to watch this film at this moment, because this, you know, of all the things that this film is about, it's also just about how people share space. And I miss sharing space, crowded space with people a great deal right now.
I wanted to ask you about that, because this film seems to be made up of so many serendipitous moments of brief and intimate contact on the street. I mean, in city spaces, in public spaces. This is a film about public space and the intimate spaces that move through public space. Mm-hmm. And I wonder how what is happening now makes you look at this film and the approach that you took and the ways that you talk to people. Can you imagine making another film like this, or has like the moment for making a film like this kind of passed?
Oh God, I hope not, right? I hope it's just, I mean, the method of the film is so central to what it is. This is a film that's, for me, as much exploring how people are doing. It's also about exploring how we live together, what it means to even think of ourselves as sharing a common world, and the sort of the inhabiting particular spaces, whether that's a neighborhood or a street corner or any kind of crowd. A beach is such a profound expression of just the very fact that we share a planet together, or we share a city together, or we share a nation together. And so I feel like in some ways that's for me one of the hardest things about the last few months is the profound disconnection to this constant reminder that's also a necessary mechanism of accountability, that we're in something together, that the world isn't actually a set of chosen pods or bubbles, as much as we might be encouraged to live as if it is. It's instead in this messy coexistence and codependence, and whether that means we rely on each other to navigate traffic signs according to the same rules so that we don't bump into each other, or in much more complicated ways, in terms of stewardship over shared resources. So yeah, I feel like the method of the film for me, it was, part of making this film was just an attempt to escape some of my own bad feelings and hard feelings by connecting with other people. And so this method of just talking to strangers and finding spaces in the city in which strangers are sharing space was so central to enacting it as a film. And regardless of what I make next, I hope that as a method is possible again. I don't know I don't know if I'd want to make a film otherwise.
What was the genesis of this film? Like, what's its origin story?
Yeah, it has a few sort of origin stories. I mean, part of the origin story is just, and this is something we've talked about a bit, and I know you've written really beautifully about, my own noticing of a disinterest, a strange disinterest in so-called climate change narratives, climate change novels, climate change films, documentary or fiction. And I think of myself as a very politically involved person. I'm certainly very concerned about the ecological crisis. I take in a lot of information. I try and act politically in the world. And so there felt like there was this disconnect between my own sense of urgency, that includes a sense that, of all the different ways that we should be acting, some of them in terms of activism, journalism, we also need to be making art about the climate crisis. I myself was disinclined to watch these films. So I took that as an occasion to sort of think about what I felt like a lot of work was doing and what it wasn't doing, and what kinds of questions I felt weren't being asked that a project that I could make might start to ask. And so for me, I think that I noticed the way in which a lot of climate change documentaries in particular hang on this sort of function of imparting information, the sort of assumption that and I'm sure, in some ways this assumption is correct or has been in the past, but the assumption that the problem is one of unknowing. We don't know enough, we don't believe enough. And so the role of a film,
if people just knew, they would do something different and the world would change.
Knowledge equals power, knowledge equals action. And I just don't think that that's, even if that's ever been true, and I'm not sure it is, it doesn't feel like it's true now. I actually think we're bombarded by information, and that information has its own paralyzing effect. So I was really interested in, and still am, in paralysis, especially when the threat at hand is an existential one. If we're supposed to be creatures who want to survive, how is it that we can be involved in this sort of slow march towards our own extinction?
This actually relates a little bit to what you were talking about before. And also what I see is one of the real threads in the film, which is even from the very beginning, there's this incredible tension between, or maybe an exploration of the relationship between aloneness and the collective. And I feel like in terms of climate change and in terms of information and action, this is a very meaningful tension to be exploring. You know, in the film we have, you know, Janet is working out alone in her studio at the beginning, and then we have the group working out at the end. Really seems like dancing right at the end together. The eclipse also is this moment where it is sort of taken throughout the film as this sort of thread of this longer moment where, but it's also this private moment where literally everyone puts on dark glasses and they kind of disappear individually behind these dark glasses, and they're sort of cut off from the world around them. And they have this very private experience, but everyone is for a moment staring and in the exact same direction at the exact same thing, having this shared experience of being alone. And so I was wondering how you were thinking about aloneness or loneliness in terms of climate change and the collective, and the kinds of questions you were interested in while you were making this film.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in some ways, this is a sort of theme that I'm preoccupied by in all my work, and yet I also feel like it was one of my it was one of the things that I learned through the course of making this film. You know, the questions I was asking were really basic ones, at least in my own mind. You know, how are we coping? What stories are we telling ourselves? How are we translating our anxiety? Are we feeling our anxiety as such? Where do we put it? What do we do with it? And one of the things that sort of surprised me as I went along conversing with people for this project is that rather than express always and constantly the kind of dread and anxiety that I myself have been feeling and that I expected everyone else to want to talk about, there would be often a sort of quick move to some sort of form of an optimistic take on one's circumstances. And yet at the same time, it also seemed like anytime anyone expressed like the hope or desire or expectation that things were going to be fine, whether it's around a housing eviction or job hunt or something else, the terms that they'd often do that were in really individualist terms. And I think you're absolutely right that once I started observing that, the sort of terrible loneliness of being and considering ourselves and our struggles on this planet as individuals suddenly became everything that I could see. And I think that there are really powerful, you know, symbols of that. I certainly think, you know, was a beautiful interpretation of the eclipse. And I think that the eclipse is symbolic for a lot of reasons, but exactly that. It is this act that people were engaged in on their own, of trying to look at something that they're not allowed to look at. And then it's also this beautiful, I mean, the reason that the eclipse as an event was so joyous was precisely because it was a collective act. We had the eclipse as a common. And I think that everything about modern life, contemporary capitalist life, discourages us from thinking about the world in common. And we're convinced over and over again by the structures that we live in that our struggles are ours to overcome on individual terms through competitive structures, through entrepreneurship, through pluck and determination. And I think of that as a kind of terrible loneliness. And I wanted to have moments in the film that it could be juxtaposed with the possibilities of a kind of collective experience and a collective power, because I do think that that's probably our only way out.
I wonder, because I think that part of what makes your film so powerful is that you're talking about these large, abstract, systemic sort of issues and ways that things move in our world, and who has power and who doesn't, and who wields it and in what ways. But watching the film is a very intimate and sort of moving experience. I don't feel like someone's talking at me about capitalism, but like, of course, this whole film is about capitalism, right? Among many other things. And so I sort of want to talk about the people in your film for a moment, because they are the thing that makes this film so alive. And it has this big beating heart because all of these people are sort of opening themselves to you in these moments of honesty and sort of either tenderness or vulnerability that are kind of incredible. Especially because many of them you had, 2 to 3 to 5 to 10 minute conversations with, and then you parted ways again. So I wanted to ask you how did you cast your film, right? Because I don't know how many people you talked to and how many ended up being sort of in the film and how many ended up being central or integral to the structure of the film. How did you decide who was in the film?
Yeah, yeah, and you know, there wasn't anything terribly systematic or schematic about it, I have to say. We interviewed a lot of people. I mean, the thing about a film like this, which is predicated in its very form on, at least in my own mind when we were starting out, on what I just call conversations with strangers and kind of brief encounters, in which the conversations themselves would be kind of digressions. Like it was really important to me that this wasn't just that it was going to be a chorus film where we talked to a lot of people, but I didn't want to know who we were going to meet, which makes planning production really difficult. But that was part of the whole point, was that people need to be able to surprise us, and we have these ephemeral encounters with people all the time that inform our worldview. And I wanted the film to replicate that in some ways. But of course, at the same time, thinking as much as is possible about the diverse kinds of experiences that make up cohabitation in the city, right? The city means very different things, can be an entirely different city, depending on who you are and what neighborhood you live in, how you're racialized, what your income is, what your gender is, and so on. So I did feel important to try and allow for these differences in how people, depending on what their days are like and their lives are like and their power relations are, to to be present in the film. But I'd say, I mean, we probably talked to, I think we had 250 release forms at the end of 1 month of shooting, and I handed off all of this footage. There was something like 100 hours of footage. I handed it off to our editor and told him to take a first pass, because of course I'd by that point fallen in love with everybody. I mean, I was sort of like, I'm of the opinion that if you ask people in real life, if you ask people honest questions that have a surprising intimacy to them, people are not only much more generous than you ever expect in terms of what they'll tell you, but also people are complicated and full of what seem like contradictions, but that's just because they're real people. And so I find everybody quite interesting, which makes it hard then to edit things into a film. But of course, so I'd had all these experiences with people, and I needed someone who had not had those experiences to then watch this footage and to help me figure out what translated. And I think, I mean, really just looking for people, for moments in which it would be really challenging to reduce anyone to an idea of what they should be. That was the most important thing. And I feel like the interviews that were in some ways easiest to cut were the ones that would, where there was something practiced. We met a few people that, as part actually of the hustle of being an entrepreneur in a place like New York City, where you're constantly having to do performance work to get clients or to do whatever else, they tend to be kind of practiced about their persona on camera. And so that was one way in which I felt like I could figure out who to leave on the cutting room floor. But other than that, it was actually really hard. And I feel like most of the people that we interviewed may still come, get to be on camera, get to be in a different cut if I ever make another cut of this film. But yeah, I wanted people to be able to speak, people who are speaking off theme and who could surprise our expectations of them.
There's a lot of humor in the film, but you're never poking fun at your subjects. It feels like you take your subjects very, very seriously as people. And because you seem to respect your subjects so much, I kept wondering about public space and privacy, right? Particularly these moments where, like there's the one where the people are riding down the escalator, or the one where the person is silhouetted in what I assume is their own window. And they feel like these very intimate moments when people, as you're saying, like they don't have their public face on, they don't have their they're not performing, and they're not performing for you, which is part of, it's what you see in a city all the time when you walk around, right? There's a bunch of people who are just sort of lost in their own thoughts. But I wondered about, filming those moments and how you feel about respecting people's privacy in public, which I think is a weird thing to think about right now, because so much of our lives is public, particularly with like digital information, and like it feels like we're just all kind of leaching out of like in every direction with no control. And so I wonder how you think about perhaps in the long history of street photography, right, where the idea is to take these intimate moments. How do you feel about about when people don't know they're being filmed and you're filming them and putting them up? Yeah, like the girl with the duck, who was both funny and also I couldn't tell if she knew that she was being filmed, or if you talked to her afterward, or that kind of thing.
Well, I definitely try not to film. I definitely don't pretend that I'm not there, and I try and make people aware that I'm filming them. I feel like it's really important to be public myself about what I'm doing, but also to be bold about it, because I feel like there's a way in which conversations about privacy can also mask another pernicious problem, which is the problem of neglect and abandonment. And so I'm really interested in the way in which we, as a culture, have trained ourselves to use privacy as a kind of excuse for a gross neglect, a kind of social neglect. We have this double standard where, as individuals, we're supposed to respect each other's privacy so intensely that we'll just walk by someone who's unhoused on the street, and yet allow the state or allow the military or allow big corporation to mine all sorts of data and information about our lives. So we have absolutely no privacy when it comes to entities and institutions that have immense power over our lives, and yet try and operate by these codes of privacy in our dealings with each other. And so that's all to say that I have to try and walk that balance when I'm making a film, because I do think people have a right to understand what someone is trying to do with their image or extract from them when they're walking around with a camera, and that puts me in a position of power when I'm filming, obviously. So the camera that I use is really big. I'm walking around with a crew of 3 people. We've got a sound person with us with a huge boom. So there's no real, we're not hiding behind trees. We're making ourselves very present. I usually tell people I'm there. But I try not to overcompensate for this idea that we're not allowed to know anything about each other's lives, and instead allow myself as a filmmaker, but also as a citizen of the planet, a person who's sharing a space in a city with people, to let myself look at them and respond to them and tell them what I'm doing. As kind of a part of, I don't know, I think that there can be new relations of power that are enacted in those moments, and relations of solidarity rather than just exploitation and extraction.
So to move a little bit from the filming process into the editing room, I would love to hear you talk about the structure of this film, because it's absolutely hypnotizing. I mean, it's this lyric, wide-ranging sort of mosaic, which feels on some level deeply intuitive, and feels like it arose out of the footage in some way. So I'm really curious how you came to this particular non-narrative associative approach for this film, and also why you think this form matters in terms of this particular content.
Yeah, so the conceit of the film all along, and deliberately, was always going to be that it's a film shot entirely over the course of 1 month in one city. Those were the formal limits, and also the narrative limits of the film. And it's a kind of experiment to say, I'm interested in questions of how people are coping and living with the dread of existing in an age of climate catastrophe and capitalist catastrophe. And I genuinely don't know the answer to that. I think the answers are multitude. And so I'm going to use this method of trying to, of having these conversations and observing these moments out of the course of a month. And I really thought of the film as, less a sort of narrative. I mean, there's certainly no plot, no dramatic arc that gets followed, but I did think of it as a kind of, less than a time capsule than almost like a soil sample, if that makes sense. I was thinking about like what it would mean to sort of extract this sort of like place and month in all these hours of footage, and then see what it is, see if it could be all moved around and reshaped and reconfigured using the magic of cinema. The order changed. It's not chronological, but rearranged using juxtapositions, using edits, using even strange zoom-ins to make something that offers offers a kind of mirror back to us in a different kind of way. So I'd often talk about this film as a kind of archival film, but an archive that's not waiting for decades to pass, but rather can be produced in the now for ourselves now, but also for future generations. So that's all, fine and well as a set of conceits for the project, but it definitely posed a lot of challenges in the edit room, precisely because it's so open-ended. Again, we could have decided that the film needed to unfold chronologically over the course of the month of August 2017, but there was no reason for that wouldn't have been, wouldn't necessarily have been anything to be gained narratively from that. So I think my editor and I really just thought of this as a kind of puzzle where we could arrange these pieces in all sorts of ways, and we still can. This doesn't have to be the only version of the film. But if the point is to try and re-see our own existence in some way, see ourselves through sort of a sideways glance, or through the eyes of that duck, or through the eyes of this narrator that seems like she's speaking from another moment in time, then we would have to do some hard work, sort of figuring out where we wanted to begin and where we wanted to end. And really the film works associatively. I think you said this, it works less through a kind of plotting out of any kind of narrative arc, and more through a sort of arrangement of all these pieces. What happens if we begin with this idea, with this moment? Where can we get to? What needs to be built? And some of that followed the course of the month. I mean, I was filming in real time. I didn't know what was going to happen. I knew, other than the fact that there was going to be a total eclipse, I didn't know that neo-Nazis were going to march into the city of Charlottesville, halfway through the month. And when that happened, it still feels terribly significant. And it felt like everything that happened afterwards was imprinted by that, that the latent and sometimes explicit white supremacy that people in New York as elsewhere were dealing with crystallized in that moment, and then, and we could never escape it afterwards. So knowing that about the experience of the month helped us sort of build some of that structure into the film, so we could plant some of the seeds at the beginning and have them, have them add up to with other moments that we laid the throughout the film. But I'll just say, the film took a month to shoot, and we edited it for a year. So it was certainly a challenge to sort of to figure out how to actually structure it.
I feel like art always changes with time, right? I wonder if you have rewatched this film recently, and since that month and since that year of editing, we have seen the coronavirus pandemic. We have seen the rise of right nationalism around the world in very overt ways. We've also seen a major new chapter of the civil rights movement opening, and the struggle particularly for Black liberation around the world. And so I feel like, I wonder if you watch this film now, which, as you say, was thought of even as being archival in the moment that you were making it. I wonder if it reads differently to you now in any interesting ways.
You know, I haven't rewatched it, and I even when it first came out, I couldn't bear to watch it anymore because I'd watched it so many hundreds of times in the making of it. And it meant that, you know, part of the struggle making a film like this is you just lose perspective, and everything is in how things appear. I mean, I think the film means something on first watch, but it also means something in context. So I do think watching it now would feel, even if you're watching it for the first time, would feel very different from what it was like for people to watch it for the first time a year and a half ago. And I do think it's the kind of film that also absorbs, you know, it's a film as much about sort of structures of power and cohabitation and social life as it is also feelings that we can't give language to. So I've noticed at film screenings, people will often raise their hands and start by just saying how they feel, and they can feel really different things. I've had people say, "Oh, I feel, you know, why did you make such a depressing film? This is just like, now I'm so stressed out and depressed." And other people say, "Oh, I feel actually quite peaceful. Like, and I didn't realize I'd watch a film about climate change anxiety and feel sort of like so peaceful at the end of it." So I think that there's room. We deliberately built in room in this film to kind of absorb and to um, allow for where people are at when they're watching it. And so I don't know the answer, you know, what it's like. I think that I'm having this feeling when I watch anything these days of already existing, despite the fact it's only been a few months, already existing in a time in which we're nostalgic for the immediate past.
Yeah, like
we're
last week.
we're in the
Yeah.
grip. Like, time itself is absolutely so strange right now.
Yeah.
And there is something, I think, that's obviously particular to the pandemic, but I think is also expressive of a kind of acute, you know, it's like the climate crisis is rendered bizarrely abstract for some people and also acute at the same time. And then there's something about the pandemic that materializes things. I mean, it's organized our lives in such rigid ways, you know. And so I have this feeling watching any kind of television or movies of which I just feel totally dislocated. Like, what is this life that I'm seeing on screen? It was my life, but that life is no longer. That life is already passed. And so I think that's also emblematic of a way of, in some ways, seeing and feeling the urgency of the climate crisis more acutely. Does that make sense? I mean,
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
know you write so much also about organizing and thinking about our own climate grief and how to even inhabit it as a narrative, you know, historical narrative. So I'd be curious to hear you talk about what it's like to think about that in relation to how people are negotiating, or how you're negotiating what it's like to live in the pandemic times.
I will answer that, and then I will also take some questions from the audience because I see a couple popping up. But there was a weird moment, and I don't know if you experienced this in the beginning of the pandemic, when it felt like everyone suddenly realized that like the ground was not stable beneath their feet and that it could all go away at any moment. And it was a very odd thing, because I think for a lot of people who've been working on climate issues for a long time, and maybe you felt this way also, it felt kind of like all of these internal feelings were suddenly externalized. Because for people who've been working on climate, that's how the world has felt and seemed like for a very long time. And it seemed really weird that everyone else thinks everything is so stable. And so there's this bizarre, and there's no pleasure in it, but there is a bizarre matching up finally of like one's internal state with the external world, right? And this is not good news. It doesn't bode well for most people. But that was strange in the beginning, as everyone else was sort of having these like crushing realizations. A lot of people who worked on climate seemed to be going, well, yes, I mean, this wasn't the form that I imagined, but sure, this is one way that everything falls apart. And I do think that in the past, 5-6 months, the relationships between climate, and I think not just climate change or climate vulnerability, but the idea that climate is a symptom, that climate's not the problem. Climate is a symptom of this other thing, and other symptoms that are interrelated are issues that have to do with race in particular, and class, and the ways in which people are vulnerable to, suffering under climate change are absolutely linked to the sort of root problems that are causing the various inequities that we're all feeling. And it's like everything is sort of popped. It's like, I feel like I'm living in a pop-up book, where it's like race and class and climate, and like, these are how they are all linked. And suddenly they seem very, very visible, not just to me or to people who have worked on this for years, but it's like in the New York Times, and it's just sort of what people are talking about. And there's something sort of necessary maybe about that shift. But again, it's hard. It's a hard thing to have everyone sort of moving into that space in the different kinds of ways that people are feeling it, because it's certainly not felt the same way by everyone.
And I think it's also very totalizing. I mean, one of the things that I felt like I'll just speak for myself, is struggling with, and even thinking about my relationship to the climate crisis, as an activist, as a person, as a filmmaker, was just the challenge of dealing with something that feels overwhelming, right? It's so large. And that for me was part of the problem of a lot of the work that seeks to address it through just sheer information, is that like, it doesn't address the fact that the largeness, the totalness is precisely what we can't deal with.
Right.
And so one of the questions that I found myself asking in this film was, what do people do with their fear when they don't feel like they have power? And I feel like that's one way in which we see this interconnection of racial violence and xenophobia and economic class warfare and exploitation all start to connect. There's a way in which we live in a system that requires us to think of the world in terms of a zero sum race for finite resources, which we're in competition with each other and inundated with news that there's not enough to go around. If we're not empowered to deal with that in ways that allow us to forge and feel a sense of our collective power, then we turn on each other,
and to organize differently, such that resources are shared differently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you're absolutely right. We're seeing all of that crystallize, and feel so acute in this moment. I mean, access to hospital beds, right? Like, right. Someone said to me when I was making this film, when people get really freaked out when they don't think that there's going to be enough helicopters if the seawaters rise. And, I feel like the same as we can say the exact same thing about hospital beds. We're told there's not going to be enough hospital beds. Right. And then we're alone with our sense of vulnerability to this virus.
I'm going to jump over to questions. The first one I'm seeing here is from David. The question is, have you been to New York City lately? And I feel like this relates to everything we were just talking about. What are your impressions?
Well, I have not been in New York City lately, and in part because I'm not able to go. I'm living in Toronto and the borders have been closed. Yeah, that's really intense. I mean, I have a lot of dear friends in New York. And I personally am opposed to nationalism. And so I don't often think of myself in meaningful ways belonging to a country or having allegiance to a country. And so to see my own, the borders are already always closed in lots of ways to various people, but right now my movement is restricted because of the pandemic, and I'm forced to see my friends and loved ones, but also not my loved ones, just other people who happen to live in the United States as a threat to my well-being. At least that's how the narrative is constructed because of where we're seeing the COVID hotspots. So yeah, it's really strange. It's really strange. I've been thinking a lot about New York. I miss it terribly. I have this deep love for the city. I wanted to make this film set in New York, not just because I love the city, but because what I love about the city is its denseness, is the fact that there's so many people on top of each other who are not part of my life. And I find that thrilling and necessary, and it helps me feel like alive. Yeah, it's hard. I don't know. You'll have to tell me. You all will have to tell me what it's like what New York is like right now.
It's weird. It's very strange. It feels very much on the cusp of a massive hollowing out, and it's not clear what is going to come in to fill that void. Something will. A void does not like to be left unfilled. But the city is being remade right now, and I don't think anyone knows what it's going to look like in a year or 10 years from now.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. Another question from John. Have you had any climate change deniers react to your film?
Maybe they have, but they haven't spoken to me about it. But I do think that the film itself, I wanted to program this film in some sort of program in which we could complicate the idea of climate change denial. And one of the things that I think of is the scene. It's very brief, but of course my own experience in making it was much longer, but the scene in the film that takes place on Staten Island with the women who've had their houses destroyed by Hurricane Sandy and who are complaining. One of them says, and it gets some laughs, like climate change is basically an Al Gore conspiracy and he's making a lot of money. And what was so interesting about their experience, I was talking to all these people who had stayed in this area that was prone to flooding. These women, and their houses were destroyed, and yet they didn't seem concerned. They talked as if the climate crisis was overblown, but they were also incredibly astute observers of the power dynamics that were going on around them. So yeah, in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, FEMA did try and buy them out of their homes for much less than their homes would have gone for in a typical New York sale. And guess what? Lots of people sold their houses to FEMA, and then big developers came in and are rebuilding their neighborhoods as for tourists and for new people to come in. And so they see the climate crisis not as like, fake or a hoax, but as a pretext for profit to be made on at their expense. And they're not wrong about that. So I find that really interesting. And I think that it's almost too easy for us to say the problem is climate change deniers. And I think that we're all in denial of various things in our lives that cause us immediate threat or that are too scary to look at. And I think that a radically sympathetic view would be to think about what stories we tell ourselves are vulnerable to in order to just keep going day by day. And also at the same time, actively try and fight disinformation. I mean, I also don't think that we should indulge disinformation campaigns and that they're obviously terribly dangerous. But I think it's interesting to ask, especially when we hear people speak as if they're deniers of a thing that's scientifically verified and an existential threat, where they're coming from and how we might communicate with them differently to also validate the aspects of their experience that they're fully experts of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have another question here from David. He says, I've been trying to figure out my place as an artist in current times. I think, David, you are not alone. He's wondering how you are grappling with this And I think I would sort of add to that. I wonder if you're thinking about what role art, particularly documentary, plays in a moment like this.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's a hard one because I think, personally, I don't subscribe to the idea that a documentary can change the world or that art changes the world. But I also think it's necessary for life. So I try and be humble about what I'm doing, and acknowledge that I'm not doing it because it's going to have this great effect. But I do think that a lot of different kinds of work are necessary. So I think activism is necessary. I think being out in the streets is necessary. I think putting one's body on on rail lines to block pipelines is necessary. I think good journalism is necessary. Writing books is necessary. Getting information out and doing science is necessary. And I think art plays a different kind of role. I mean, art connects us to each other. Art makes us feel alive. Art keeps our senses alive. I feel like it's very easy and a real problem to inhabit the world as sort of passive consumers of formulaic media. And for me, the difference between that and whatever art can do is that it can activate our capacity to read the world and inhabit it differently. And for me, my last film was about the US prison system. And in all of my work, I feel like I'm asking a basic question about, like, how did the world come to be the way it is now, or the way it appears to us? And how can we demystify that so it doesn't feel inevitable, so that there's space to imagine the possibility that it doesn't have to be this way. And I do think that's a way in which art can play a really profound role in.
And it strikes me that in your work, the role of estrangement is very important to that. I mean, there's a way in which you're looking at the world as it is today, but with just the lens is just askew by enough degrees that the world today looks very strange, in a way that maybe helps us see it better. This is a question also from, I think this is from Kate. She says, following up on the idea of art, could you speak a bit about the artist in the film, who's the Afronaut? And I feel like this question of estrangement and the question of what art does, I think, is very much tied to his appearance in the film.
Yeah, I mean, he was one of the few characters where we didn't run into him accidentally. We sort of sought him out, and it was because I'd read about a show in which his name's Ao had put on as part of a larger show on that was involved a bunch of artists working within the realm of what's called Afrofuturism. And the sort of preoccupations of people who are associated with Afrofuturism were very aligned with the preoccupations I had going to this film, which, have to do with, I mean, particularly in the case of Black Americans, how do we create space to imagine ourselves in the future so we can exist in the present? What are the structures of a premature death and indignity that prohibit our capacity to imagine ourselves as African Americans in the future? And how can we reclaim our sense of ourselves in the future precisely so that we can live in the present? So yeah, that is his project. And these different initiatives, like donning an Afronaut suit and walking around neighborhoods everywhere from Brooklyn to China as part of that project was, felt like a useful mechanism and reminder of the film, what the film was trying to do at this as well. Like, is there a way actually of just being dislocated for a second in time? Could that be a way to sort of remind us to be different and conduct ourselves differently now?
I'm gonna do, we have maybe 5 minutes left. I've got 2 more questions here. One is from Beverly. Can you talk about your choice to use voiceover and the role you see it playing in the film?
Yeah, I wasn't, I didn't expect to use narration. I've never used narration before. And it was my editor who had suggested it. One of the inspirations for this film was a film by Chris Marker called Le Jolie Mai, which is set in Paris in the month of May of 1962. And is also a film that's made up of just sort of ordinary conversations with strangers. And you sort of realize, you know, somewhere along the way that it's this kind of searing indictment of the French colonial project in Algeria. But it kind of sneaks up on you and it's beautifully done. And that film has a narrator. And so my editor suggested it as a kind of mechanism to less impose structure and more offer some punctuation in a film that's really made up of a lot of big ideas and a lot of small moments. And so he thought, and I think he's right, that the narrator, a voice of a narrator might just offer sort of some tent poles for things to coalesce around and help organize all of these disparate scenes a little bit. And then, and then it was sort of about figuring out what that person would say. Should that person be me? Should that person be a character? Do we need to know information about that person? I was really interested in the idea of using literature. I was obsessed with this Annie Dillard essay from 1979 about a total eclipse that my friend Christina had introduced me to. And so I liked the idea of having a narrator that we didn't have to worry too much about. Like, we don't have to know who she is, but we have this sense, we don't know where she's from or when she's from, but there's just a sense that she has some distance from what we're seeing, and she knows something that we don't. And I think that that's part of the distantiation that we were talking about. What's just a sort of mechanism that the film can provide to get you as an audience member to feel like you're both zooming in these intimate moments and also being asked to step back. And some of that is almost like a kind of science fiction. Like, sometimes the zoom out feels like, oh, we're trying to imagine the Earth from the perspective of outer space, or sometimes it's from the perspective of these animals that dot this landscape. And then sometimes it's temporally through this narrator whose voice we can't quite identify, but who inhabits another time and is looking at us.
Right. We just have one last question, which is, what are you working on next? Or what are you working on now, maybe? I don't know if those are the same
Are
questions.
any of us working on anything other than just,
I know, right?
Constant panic day, raising children and trying to get our daily work done? I mean, I'm working on some projects. I am also mostly panicking and trying to raise a 15-month-old daughter and figuring out how to teach students in the fall. But I have a few film projects that I'm just starting, and one in particular is about masculinity and modern men's movements. So we'll see what comes of that.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for being so generous in your answers. And thank you to everyone who was here.
And it's great to be in conversation. I encourage everybody to check out Meehan's writing. It's brilliant and insightful and informed. Actually, it was wonderful to read a lot of it while I was making this film. It's informed a lot of my own thinking. So thank you, and thanks.
The feeling is mutual.
And I would just like to say thanks so much to the both of you for having this great conversation. It's a brilliant film. Meehan, it's wonderful to meet you being able to meet you via this film. And I've been looking at your work, and I hope we can get you back to comment on other things, because it feels like all these ideas are so relevant right now. And Brett, I really look forward to seeing your future work. It's really fabulous. And to everyone watching from home, please, if you haven't already, and if even if you have, you might want to watch it again, because every time I see The Hottest August, I see something else in it. And I think it's super amazing. So thanks everyone for being here.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Good night.